Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening from wherever you're joining us around the globe. My name is Ibrahim Aziz Bangura. I am a drone pilot and a trainer for Sierra Leone Flying Labs.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. I am Eunice Leby, a GIS analyst and communications manager for the Sierra Leone Flying Labs. I will be your co-host for today's webinar. Over to you, Aziz, and give us a brief overview of the Sierra Leone Flying Labs.
So before we present the agenda for today, we would like to just give you a brief overview about Sierra Leone Flying Labs. So a few years back, when we started using the drone technology at Intigems, I and my colleagues, we always knew there's a community out there of robotics and drone users in Sierra Leone and in the world at large. Fast forward to 2019, the Sierra Leone Flying Labs was established, and it has 3 partner Sierra Leonean institutions: Intigems, Sensi Hub, and Trackybill. We're currently made up of 11 members who have different expertise, and our primary aim is to contribute to establishing a vibrant Sierra Leonean drone ecosystem. We also want to promote sustainability for all local robotics ecosystem by building local capacity in Sierra Leone. And currently, we provide services, especially drone services, that contribute to any of the sustainable development goals. So Sierra Leone Flying Labs is part of a global network of local knowledge hubs that is co-created by We Robotics. And you can find us in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and Oceania. Since the establishment of the Sierra Leone Flying Labs, we've been actively promoting drone technology in secondary schools and in tertiary institutions. As you can see on the screen, that was me engaging a cross-section of Sierra Leone Grammar School students during their science week. Fast forward to 2019, the Sierra Leone Flying Labs was established in May, and it has 3 partner Sierra Leonean institutions: Intigems, Sensi Hub, and then Trackybill. We're currently made up of 11 members with different expertise in GIS, photogrammetry, etc. So our main focus is we aim to contribute to establish a vibrant Sierra Leonean drone ecosystem, wherein we can promote sustainability of local robotics and building local capacity and skills. So we've also actively involved in providing drone services that contribute to any of the sustainable development goals. And our Flying Labs network is part of a global network that is co-created by We Robotics, and you can find us in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and Oceania. So over the past 4 years since the establishment of the Sierra Leonean Flying Labs, we've been actively promoting drone technology in secondary schools and then in tertiary institutions. We've also provided trainings for local institutions. One key example is the Environmental Fund of Africa, wherein we trained their staff how to capture drone data and do some form of analysis. Our future plans. So we are targeting youth and young professionals to promote the STEM system. And we hope to collaborate with Sierra Leonean institutions, specific ministries, departments, and agencies to pilot projects that will showcase the use of drone technology. Thank you. This was just a short background about Sierra Leone Flying Labs. I now hand you over to Eunice Leby, who is going to present the agenda for today, and then you have the panelist presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Aziz, for that overview. And I'll go straight to the agenda for the webinar. So for our webinar today, we will have introduction of the panelists, and we're going to have 4 presentations from each of the panelists. And next, we will have a panel discussion wherein questions will be thrown to the panelists and then they will discuss. And thereafter, we'll have questions and comments from the audience. So each panelist would have 10 minutes for every presentation. And for the audience, if you have your questions and comments, please just leave them on the chat section. And when we get to comments and questions, we would throw those questions to the panelists to answer. And after all of that, we'll have a closing remark, and that's it for the agenda for today. So let's move right ahead to introducing the panelists. So we'll start with the first. Let's have the first presenter introduce, followed by the second presenter, and the third, and finally the last. So let's have the introduction.
So, hello everyone. Hello everyone. I'm Samuel Noni. I'm a drone pilot and project manager at Track Your Build Sierra Leone, and also a member of Sierra Leone Flying Labs.
Let's have our next presenter introduce himself.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. I am Mansa Musa Kamara, a senior consultant at IntiGems and a GIS analyst. I'm also a member of the Sierra Leone Flying Labs.
Hi. Hi, everyone. My name is Ekshilubana. I am Operations Director at South Africa Flying Labs. I am also the COO at QP Drone Tech, which is our commercial arm. I come from an ICT background, having spent almost 23 years within ICT doing management consulting. And in the past 3 years, I have then moved into the drone technology space. I am also a qualified drone pilot. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. Hi, everyone. Namaste. My name is Uttam Pudasaini. I am the Executive Director at Nepal Flying Labs. I am a digital development enthusiast. Nepal Flying Lab is the first flying lab that started after 2015 Nepal earthquake. And since then, we have been working on localization of drone technology in Nepal. I'd like to thank Sierra Leone Flying Labs and friends for organizing the session today. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. So we're going to move straight ahead to our first presenter, who will be presenting on the topic, why, when, and how to use drones in disaster response. So over to you, Samuel Nuni of Track Your Build.
So as I've introduced myself earlier, I'm Samuel Noni. I'm a co-founder of Track Your Build Sierra Leone, as well as a drone pilot and project manager. So today's talk would be on drone disaster response, why, when, and how to use drones for disaster response. So disaster management is how we deal with the human, material, economic, or environmental impacts
Hello, Samuel.
Yeah.
Yes, hello. Sorry, can you get me now?
Yes, yes.
Yes, okay. So disaster management is how we deal with the human, material, and economic or environmental impacts of disasters. Disaster management has 5 pillars. Those 5 pillars are mitigation, preparedness, response. Sorry, I have a sorry. So the 5 pillars are prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. So each of those sectors are key when it comes to dealing with disasters, disaster management. So for the purpose of this presentation, we'd be dealing with disaster response and the use and role of drones within disaster response. Typically, drones can be used in 2 sections of disaster response. They can be used for UAV and drone mapping, or they can also be used for medical deliveries. Based on my experience with disaster response, I would be dealing and talking about UAV mapping and being used in emergency operations. So UAV mapping is a sector that's been around since the early 90s, but it's been more accessible over the last 10 to 15 years due to the advancements that have been made in consumer drones and the ability for anyone who owns a drone and knows how to fly it to capture images and turn those into maps that can be actionable during disasters. However, as it is with technology, there's no blanket technology that you can say you throw at any problem. So there are always instances within which drones would be useful or viable in a response situation. One key factor that determines that is the size of the area you're mapping. If, for instance, a disaster covers an area of, let's say, 100 to 200 square kilometers, the amount of time that it would take for a drone to map that area versus using satellite mapping would leave first responders in a situation wherein they can't or they won't have actionable data to respond to plan out their response. The second issue, which is one that I did experience during a response that we did in 2017, is cloud cover, wherein there was a landslide in Sierra Leone in 2017 during the rainy season. So at that point in time, the UN had tasked their Copernicus satellites to do satellite mapping of the area where it happened. But there were large sections of the area that could not be covered, could not be captured due to the cloud cover in that area. The third area would be urban environments wherein you may have data from satellites that's maybe a month or two old, or maybe 3 months old, which also would not provide you with actionable data as to what's actually on the ground at that point in time. And what's also useful is if, for instance, in the case of a landslide or flooding, you would need accurate elevation data at that point in time of the disaster, and using either a satellite map or traditional engineering methods would leave you in a situation where you won't have actionable intel to plan out your water shedding or any other response plans that you may have to help alleviate whatever people are going through at that point in time.
Hi, Samuel. Are
Yes,
you
hello.
changing the slide?
Yeah, so I'm still on this slide. I'm changing to the next slide now.
Okay, just checking. Thank you.
So in terms of our use cases, I have 2 use cases on hand today. One being the mudslide in 2017 in Freetown, Sierra Leone, the Matuma mudslide that destroyed over 1,000 houses and claimed hundreds of thousands of lives in the process. So during that disaster, it occurred during the rainy season on the 14th of August, 2017. At that point in time, the first responders needed actionable intel on where the landslide actually happened, because there were two phases of the landslide, one that was particularly visible, but another that was behind the ridge of a mountain that would have been unsafe for people to walk or traverse to take pictures and collect data. So drones were used at that point in time to, one, create a 2D and 3D map and model of the site, as well as provide videos, which were, all of that data was then used to assess the slope stability before people were sent in to study the rock face and to see what, if there was a risk of a second or third landslide at that point. So that was data that we're able to capture on the same day of the landslide and pass on the actionable data onto the first responders, so they were able to plan out their response properly. The second use case is the fire that occurred in a slum last year in Susan's Bay in Freetown, Sierra Leone. That fire destroyed roughly 234 households. What we were tasked with doing at that point in time was to create an elevation model of the site, as well as use a cloud comparison tool to determine how many houses were destroyed. We were able to do that by accessing satellite imagery that was available from February of 2021 and comparing that with a drone map that we took in March of 2021 to see how many houses were destroyed during that disaster. I have a link that I'll share, which will show the data that was collected during that exercise. So in this view, for instance, as you can see, we did a house count. The blue houses, the blue dots that are shown are houses that weren't destroyed during the fire, and the red dots show houses that were destroyed. So we were able to calculate that by, after collecting the drone map, or after processing the drone map, we switched off the drone map, and then we used the base map to calculate everything, to do a total house count, and then we're able to then determine how many houses were actually destroyed. Additionally, there's also a 3D model available. That was also captured of the site. So we're also able to use this to see what damage was caused there. Also during that period, since it was close to the rainy season, how they would then prepare or be able to put plans in place to mitigate against any flooding within that area, and other actionable data that they were able to use during that period in time for their response. So, as I said earlier, drone technology isn't technology that you just throw at any problem. So there are key questions that you always have to ask yourself when it comes to collecting the data, processing the data, hosting the data, as well as the use of the data. Because if the data that you've collected isn't presented in a format that someone who doesn't understand drone technology can use, you'd be in a situation where you've collected data that essentially the key actors wouldn't be able to prepare or make proper use of. So some of the steps that you have to look at are, for instance, one, what method to use when collecting the data. Are drones the right tool to use? If yes, what sensors are you going to use? Is it going to just be a photogrammetry survey that will be using a normal camera and a consumer drone? Would you need a LiDAR survey of the area? Would you require a thermographical survey of the area? Would there be any need for a bathymetric or a hydro survey of the area? So on and so forth. And after you've answered all of those questions, there also comes the question of who is going to fly that drone? Is that person licensed and trained? Does that person know the right standard operating procedures to operate drones in that area, so on and so forth. After you've collected the data, which is the first step, you need to then know what processing engine or software you need to use to process the data, how long it will take to process the data, what outputs will be provided, as well as to what annotations could be gathered or done with those outputs that have been used. The next step would also be aerial data hosting. One key factor is whenever you're dealing with disaster response, you'd have to share your data with people who are within that area where the disaster has happened, as well as people who are possibly outside the area or outside the country, but would still need to be in a situation wherein they can access the said data and be able to visualize and make use of it. So typically, if it's a photogrammetry survey, for instance, the best bet is always to do your processing on the cloud and share links with different people who then be able to use that data and draw whatever annotations that they need to on the maps and make whatever inferences that they need to do. Additionally, from our side, on a technical standpoint, we would also then do CAD drawings. So that those CAD drawings would then have different sections cut across different planes, which would then be used for slope stability analysis. Those planes could also be used to generate an accurate DTM of the sites, to plan out if for instance, temporal roads would have to be done, that data could be used for that. To also see how, for instance, if there's flood modeling that would need to be done, that DTM could also be used for that flood modeling, and so on and so forth. So in terms of hosting, there are different applications that you can use for that. You can either use Drone Deploy or Pix4D to process your drone map. After that, you can host your drone map in ArcGIS server or in QGIS server for people to access it, or you can also share the link from Pix4D and Drone Deploy. Lastly, and the most important, is the use of the aerial data, which is essentially how you would present the data to people who aren't drone experts, but still need to or would require use of the data that we've collected. So from my experience, that has also been a key factor wherein there's been a gap of people who would actually know how this data could be used. So after you've processed and you've done all of the annotations, you then have to walk them through how this data can be used, what you can gather from that data, and how this data could help in terms of their response plans. So that normally would involve presentations to multiple agencies, whether it's via Zoom or whether it's in person, to just ensure that everyone sees the data and fully understands the data that has been submitted to them. And that is all for my presentation. If there are any questions or comments, I'll be happy to answer them at the designated time.
Thank you, Samuel, for that wonderful presentation. If you have questions or comments about Samuel's presentation, please just have them on the chat section, which we would address later after all the presentations have been done. And so we'll move to our second presentation. But just be mindful to the presenters, this is to the presenters, you'd have 10 minutes to complete your presentation. So we'll have our second presentation, which is on drones and GIS for coastal vulnerability assessment, which is going to be done by Mansa Musa Kamara. Over to you, Mansa. Hello, Manta.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Okay. Once again, I am Mansa Musa Kamara, a senior consultant at Intigems Limited, which is also a member of the Sierra Leone Flying Labs Consortium. My talk today will be on drones and GIS for disaster preparedness. I'll be using a case study of coastal vulnerability assessment in Sierra Leone to bring to you how drone can be and GIS can be utilized for disaster preparedness. Before we proceed, I just want us to get a slight insight into what disaster preparedness really entails. Really, it's about the available capacities and the knowledge that we have built, whether through government institutions, professionals, or at local level, or have built individually to be able to effectively anticipate, respond, recover from the impacts or the imminent likely impacts of a current hazard or on condition. This is a classical definition that UNISDR has presented. Now, just to give a quick background, as you can see, Sierra Leone has a long stretch of coastline, which is about 500 kilometers. And this particular area is quite critical and important for Sierra Leone. One, because it is home to the capital city, Freetown, as well as its home. If you take a 500-meter buffer from the coastline, you would find over 100,000 households within that zone, as well as nearly 700,000 people within that particular 500-meter zone from the coastline. And the coastal area of Sierra Leone is quite critical also because it's one of the major tourism sources of revenue. It's also very important for our fisheries sector, maritime travel. As you may be aware, we have a natural harbor right there in Freetown, as well as agriculture and aviation. However, despite this vast beauty of our coastal area and the vast importance of our coastal area, Sierra Leone is ranked third, just behind Guinea-Bissau and Bangladesh in terms of vulnerability to climate change. Over the past years, we have seen frequent natural disaster events, coastal floodings, erosions, and storm surges in some critical areas in Freetown, as well as outside Freetown in the other parts of Sierra Leone, which has led to significant damages in property, led to injuries, as well as the loss of major livelihood sources for people within the coastal areas. Now, the government of Sierra Leone, through its partners, as well as development agencies, have been implementing several projects for managing disaster risk. However, one major challenge for disaster adaptation is the lack of information, or in some cases, there is a very limited access to information, even when that is available. And this really impedes coastal zone management policy formulation and also the implementation of those policies in order to be prepared for disaster events. As a result of this, the UNDP, through a JEF-funded project, contracted Intigems to undertake coastal vulnerability assessment for 6 communities, 3 of which are in the western area, Laka, Tombo, Hamilton, and the others, Conakry, Shenge, and Tortu Islands in the other regions of the country. The main objective of this project really was to be able to identify and analyze existing factors that contribute to climate change vulnerability in these communities in order to empower the locals as well as the decision makers to manage climate change risks impacts on their infrastructure and livelihood. There are several partners, including governments, MDAs, as well as academia, in implementing these particular projects. Now, to execute this project, GIS, which is Geographic Information Systems, was very critical. How so? This was mostly because whatever disaster event or hazard situation that is present, it has a location component to it, and that makes it inherently geographic. Therefore, as part of these projects, we developed an integrated coastal vulnerability index. We got these indices for each of the 6 study areas. To get these indices, we had to come up with physical vulnerability index, as well as socioeconomic vulnerability index, which were made up of several variables, most of which have a location component to it, most of which have imagery or spatial data that is tied to them. These included geology, elevation, sea level rise, shoreline change for the physical areas, as well as for the social population density, land use, land cover, building footprint density, as well as access to utility and social services. Now, the challenge we faced was that in the classical coastal vulnerability assessment, the most important data sources are usually providers of free and open source imagery from, for example, Sentinel, the Landsat, OpenStreetMap, Google Earth, also Esri imagery. However, what we found was that our study area was quite small, and because this wasn't a large-scale study, say at national level, these particular data sources, which were usually have very low resolutions, ranging from 10 to 30 meters, were not very suitable to meet the particular objectives of our assignments. Therefore, and also a lot of these data were quite out of date, they were old. And if you want to do assessments based on these data, you'll be getting data that is not representing the particular temporal resolution that you need. We also found out that in most areas, there were data gaps, which were mostly, as Samuel mentioned, cloud cover is a major concern in these instances. So the solution became, the challenge now is, if you use these data sets, which we have found to have serious limitations, then it's mostly, as the programmers will say, garbage in, garbage out. The quality of your output is as good as the quality of the data that you input. And that is how drones became very much important for this particular assignment. Now, with the drones, we were able to capture digital surface models, we're able to capture land use, land cover maps. We're able to also generate overview automosaics in order to be able to extract features that will be used as input variables for our coastal vulnerability indices. And what we got was that the drone data, we got it right at the time that we needed the data. It was right within the resolution, sub-meter resolution in some instances, and less than 5-meter resolution in other instances where it was challenging to have a low flight, and which was of high quality when you compare it to the free open source satellite image resources. So these are some of the outputs. Like for Conakry, we were able to delineate an area off the coast and within the immediate vicinity of the coastline. We flew drones there at 100 to 120 meters above ground level in order to capture the various features. We also generated digital surface models to be able to extract digital terrain as well as digital elevation models, from which we could derive slopes, we could derive other features that were inputted into the physical vulnerability in the indices. We also got overview aerial photographs. As much as we needed physical features, which were geology and other areas, we also needed socioeconomic variables. Just having an overview aerial picture of the study area gave us some understanding as to how these the infrastructure and everything is situated within that particular community, and it gives us a bird's eye view perspective of the area. We also got video outputs as well. And sorry, as you can see, this is Tombo. Tombo is one of the most, if not, it's perhaps the largest fishing community in Sierra Leone. And from the imagery, you have hundreds and hundreds of buildings. But what we observed from OpenStreetMaps was that the buildings were coming so fast that the pace at which buildings were coming up as a result of them being makeshift buildings was faster than the pace of the OSM data updates. So to digitize the buildings from these areas, we had to rely seriously on the drone aerial image that we captured. Now, after having all of the data, ensuring that we have the data to the quality that we needed to get to the analysis aspect of it. And this is where geographic information system came in. Using the GIS, we were able to come up with algorithms using a classical coastal vulnerability assessment approach, which is the analytical hierarchical process, which has been utilized widely. We were able to ensure that the phenomenon that we were investigating, coastal erosion, sea level rise, these are complex phenomena that we needed to understand and to ensure that we can get the characteristics of each of our project sites without necessarily having to get to every part of the place. And this ultimately was able to enable us to make decisions and rank the coastline of each of our communities into various levels of vulnerability. Now, what we did was we segmented the coastline of each area and gave them grids. We had, and based on all the features, we were able to come up with, for each variable, we're able to come up with a risk factor. The final outputs we got was, you can see, we ranked each of the coastlines into very low, moderate, high, and very high vulnerability. And this is particularly important because these findings from this study, the results from this analysis was very useful in developing adaptation action plans, which were to either protect the sea walls or to accommodate the risk by implementing specific measures, as well as to complement by using public awareness, monitoring, as well as you can retreat by having coastal setbacks or realignments. Each of these 4 adaptation action categories were suitable for specific segments of the coastline. And this was not going to be possible if we did not have granular data that is to a high resolution as what you would get from a drone. And also if we're not able to do the analysis in a GIS that can segment the coastline. I think we come to an end. I thank you all very much for your attention. Like the host has mentioned, we will be open to answering all your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mansa Musa, for that wonderful presentation on drones and GIS for coastal vulnerability assessment. Yes, this indeed was very informative. So again, if you have your questions and comments, please just write them down on the chat section, which we would address later. Now we're going to our 3rd presentation, which is mapping of informal settlement for disaster preparedness, which will be done by Jack Silubane by South Africa Flying Labs. Over to you, Jack.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can all hear me and see my screen.
Yes.
Okay, this is, I'm going to be talking a little bit about a project that we are doing in South Africa, which is mapping a portion of a township, you know, which is an informal settlement site of one of South Africa's oldest townships. So the reason for this is that because of climate change, new risks are beginning to emerge in areas where typically there were no natural disasters such as your flooding and your tropical cyclones and all that. So South Africa was one of those where we could probably once in a while, only on the eastern coast, on the Indian Ocean side, experience disasters. But these have become commonplace in the past 5 years. They have become regular occurrences. And what we have done is to try and alert, you know, the administrations at various levels to say, let's be prepared for disaster, because we have had cyclone Eloise, we have had a number of tropical storms that have affected the country, not just in the coast, but even inland. I mean, Johannesburg, it's in Gauteng, which is inland. And we have been talking to the administration to say, let's be prepared. With the informal settlement that we are looking at, and we are going to see some of the auto mosaic, there is a river that runs along the township, which floods during rainy season. And it's one of those reasons why we said, let us focus on this particular informal settlement so that we can acquire the relevant data, which will enable us to do some analytics on it, and then we can present to the city of Joburg, the provincial government, and ultimately to the National Disaster Management Center, for them to be able to see how you can use drone data to prepare for disaster, to prepare mitigation plan, and also to respond to disasters so that we are not caught unaware. And that really is where this particular project comes from. So this is the area that we are talking about. It's called Stretla, which is delineated in red. It's called Stretla, and Stretla has got its own meaning. So that's the area that we are looking at. As you can see, it's part of a much bigger township. So we flew drones to acquire the images there, and then we used Pix4D and Metashape technology. The reason we use both, we wanted to do a comparison, you know, of the two photogrammetry software to look at what will the differences be. But in the end, they gave us obviously the same kind of result. So that is the informal settlement that we are looking at. This is the orthomosaic of that area, and we did, I think, about 6 flights in that area, and then we were able to generate a high quality orthomosaic of that, which we then were able to use to generate the digital elevation model, which you can see on the left, and on the right, it's a drainage and accumulation model for flood analysis. So on the left-hand side, you can see the differences of colors. Obviously, the red says that is the highest elevation, and then the dark blue would be your lowest elevation points. You can see the highest points. That's where the river is actually flowing. On the right-hand side, this is because this on the right-hand side, that is where you have your drainage and accumulation. You know, the darker blue shows the water flows. And then the light blue shows where the highest accumulation of water is. This is also where the river EXK is flowing. And we are generating this to be able to give graphic images to the authorities, the guys who do emergency response, the guys who do planning, the guys who do disaster management, because we want the pictures to speak to what they want to be able to see. And that's why we had to put these graphics so that we are not just presenting it in a language that is understandable for a drone technologist, but in a language that a disaster management practitioner will be able to see. You know, this is the problem that we have, and what is it that I can do to be able to do this. We want this to be usable and relevant for the work that they do. So one was the water flow, and we wanted to do two things: flood risk analysis. The other one we will see later, it's a fire risk, because both of them are present disasters that we are dealing with. So this shows the water flows. As you can see, where you have more lines, that's where there is the highest flow of water. That is the drainage model that we have developed for them, and we are busy engaging with them. We've had engagements with them. They want us to come and have more deeper workshops with them with an in-depth report for their use. This is the risk map for flood that we have generated, where the red shows the areas that are at high risk for flood. You know, and where you see the red, that's the areas where there is the highest risk for flooding, and the green shows the lowest risk. And then we went to look at the fire risk consideration. So this is an informal settlement. The informal settlement, typically the dwellings are made of corrugated iron, and sometimes because of the rain, people put plastic covering on them. They put, I don't know what a sail is, you know, some of those. They put them over to try and cover the rain. So that increases obviously the risk of fire and all that. So what we did here was to use the land use database, which we then overlaid on the auto mosaic that we have to, based on the type of settlements that we have. Then we were able to generate a fire risk. We are able to generate a fire risk model. It also includes the type of dwelling, the vegetation. So here, where I am pointing, I'm not sure what the color is there. This is an area with an informal settlement with bare vegetation. So there is typically very little vegetation. If you see there, it's just informal dwellings. And then where you have the purple, this is with higher vegetation, with mid vegetation. This is low vegetation, and then the green, that's where you have trees. So here there will be grass, and then here there will be trees. And all those present various scenarios in terms of proneness to fire. And then we out of that, generated this fire risk model. And with this, by the way, we have not, what we have not factored in is the closeness, the proximity of one dwelling to another. And if you were to look at the dwellings, they are very close to each other, generally within a meter. So if we were to factor that, the entire area would essentially be red. So the fire risk, it's also a very high risk for this area, depending on the type of material, the vegetation, and the rest of the other aspects that we have looked at. And this is what we are then engaging the authorities about, so that the relevant kind of plans can be made to mitigate the kind of disasters in that area. So they will be able to then develop, and we are making recommendations for them so that they can ensure that this settlement is safer, I think, going forward. Let me just finish there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack, for that presentation. Sure, it is a very good approach to map out informal settlements, especially when it comes to disaster preparedness, for example, flooding and fire. So that was a very good approach. Well done to you guys. Let us now move to our last and final presentation, which is going to be done by Uttam. He's going to present on drones for humanitarian open spaces. Uttam of Nepal Flying Labs, over to you.
Thank you, Mofon. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. In my presentation today, I will be sharing some experiences of my team in Nepal who worked on identification and mapping of open spaces project. I would like to start with by sharing this image. So Nepal was hard hit by a massive earthquake in 2015. After the 2015 earthquake, a lot of affected population, they lived outside of their house for quite a time because there were aftershocks coming in, and so people were afraid to go inside of their home. And this image on the left-hand side, it's an open space in the central part of Kathmandu city. So as you can see on the image, there are a lot of different small structures that was built on the ground. So these were the temporary shelters that was built by affected population. And if you look at the right-hand side, that's a Google Earth image of the current location. So if we try to understand the current context of these kind of open spaces in a rapidly urbanizing city like Kathmandu, there is a few screenshots that I took from some of the research that has been done by other people. So on the left-hand side, you can see how the land use land cover area of Kathmandu is changing over time. So in around 1970, the built-up area of Kathmandu was so less, but with increase in population and building density, now the built-up area has grown significantly. And on the right-hand side, there is another research that kind of predicts what the built-up area is going to look like in another like 25 to 30 years. And the situation looks quite dangerous. Dangerous in a way that almost all of the area is going to be covered by built-up area. That means there is only a less amount of area available for open and green spaces. Open and green spaces are very important in the context of urbanizing cities. So it's very important to understand the general concept of what an open space is. So in general, open spaces are like general areas that people can use for different purpose, like recreational purpose or gathering or meeting and a number of other activities. If you try to understand it from a disaster management perspective, then open spaces are usually identified and mapped so that these kind of areas can be used in a disaster context for a number of different purposes. So it could be either for keeping the internally displaced population, or it could be utilized as a place for distribution of different sort of relief items after a disaster. So open spaces, they are not just for nature and environment. Open space are important assets of an urban context. And as you can see on the photo, like from basic recreational purpose to a disaster situation, open space are very important in an urbanizing city. It's very important to identify and map open space, not just because they are important from an environmental perspective, but in day-to-day life activities, open spaces are very important. And particularly in a disaster context, open spaces can be utilized for keeping the internally displaced population, and for managing shelter, wash, and other facilities to them. My team at Kathmandu, we got a chance from International Organization of Migration to work in a few identification and mapping of open spaces project. So this project, I'll just briefly talk about the methodology that we applied in the project. So it was like a 5-step approach methodology that we adopted in the project. First, we started by interacting with the local governments. So if we are doing open space mapping in a city area, the first thing we do is we go to the local government and we talk to them and we try to learn from them what are the existing open spaces and public land in their area. So after we have a preliminary list of open spaces, the second step, it usually involves categorizing these open spaces based on international standard. Because for any location to be humanitarian open space, it needs to meet certain criteria. So for example, it should have a certain amount of area. It should have a certain type of landscape slope. It should be free from risk and hazard locations nearby. So after we apply this sort of criteria, then a second level of open space list is identified. And once this list is identified, what we do is we send our surveyors to the field and we try to do collect as much data as possible. So in this particular project, instead of following a ground-based surveying techniques, we followed a drone-based mapping approach. I will later on explain why we did that. But after we collected the data of open space, then we came back to the office, we processed the data, all the maps were prepared, and instead of just giving the orthophoto maps and DEM to the local government, we came up with a number of different visualization techniques that I will share a bit later. And after all this task was done, again, we sat together with the local government and we kind of persuaded the local government to publish these open spaces in their yearly documents so that there is a commitment from the local government regarding preservation and promotion of these sort of important assets. So we did drone-based aerial mapping of open spaces, particularly because, in an urban context, usually, and this is a drone image of one of the urbanizing city in Kathmandu. And if you look at the image, then you can see only a few areas we have open spaces. So if we use a drone data to create maps for open space, then it helps us to understand the context of the area, what is located in the vicinity of the open space, whether there are like safe routes available or not in case of a disaster situation. So that's why we use drones. And also, as I mentioned earlier, the images from the drones, it gives us a unique perspective, which helps us to understand what is the scenario, what is the landscape around the open space. So for example, this is an open space from one semi-urban ward in a rural municipality. As you can see in the image, there is a good size open space, but then there is like a landslide next to the open space. That means this area might be suitable as a humanitarian open space, but there needs to be certain risk reduction measures needs to be implemented before this area is designated as a proper humanitarian open space. So we made use of drones, we collected the data set. And after we collected the data set and did all the mapping activities, we created 4 different kinds of visualization for an easy understanding for the local government. The first thing we did was, whatever maps we prepared in this project, we compiled those maps as a map book. And these maps, they were prepared in local languages so that the local community would understand the elements of the map. So as you can see on the animation video that's playing, this is a map book that has the summary of all the data set. And the map book, it looks like a photo album. So there are like photos of all the open space. There is information regarding the total area and different sort of maps. And we particularly prepared 3 different maps for each open space. So the first map we did was like a topographical map of the area, because in a disaster scenario, a topographical map of an open space is very important for a humanitarian agency to plan like temporary shelters in the area, how many temporary shelters are possible in the area, what is the slope of that land, and all that information. So the first thing we did was like prepare the topographical map. We also prepared the orthophoto image map and then delineated like the area into two different regions. What is the usable open area that is available and what is the non-usable area that is available? Because this information is also useful in a disaster context. The actual area that will be used is a openly available usable area, right? So we also delineated those kind of details on the image. And the third map we prepared was a vicinity map for each open space, because only having an open space information is not useful. You need to know which is the nearest health facility from an open space, which is the nearest security center from an open space. So we also created the map of those critical facilities around an open space. And all these maps, they were compiled like a map book, as you can see on the photo, and handed it over to the local government. And on a couple of times, in several occasions, what happened is organizations, they just submit their reports to the local government, but then the community always lack access to those kind of detail. So we came up with 3 different approaches. The first thing we did was we designed and installed community maps. So as you can see on the photo, on the background of those 2 people, we design and install big size community maps, and then we install it at different locations in the community. And likewise, Nepal has a very integrated disaster information management platform. We also, through IOM, these data sets, and from the support of National Disaster Management Authority, all these data sets that we collected was uploaded to National Disaster Information Management Center. That means now everyone can go to the website and they can download all the data set that we collected. And not only that, but we also developed a mobile application. Because for example, in the context of a disaster scenario, what happens is people, they need one-click information on their hand, right? So if I want to go to an open space, all I should do is just tap like show me the nearest open space, and then the app itself navigates you to the nearby open space. And also it gives you information regarding what is the total capacity of that open spaces and what are the different facilities available in that area. So this is how we kind of like disseminated the output of the project. But having said all that, like we didn't do a complete work, I would say, because we only stopped until the identification and mapping of the open space. But that alone is not sufficient, and that alone does not guarantee the protection and promotion of open space. So I would like to mention 4 different recommendations based on our learnings from the project. And this could also be applied to other urbanizing cities in the world. So the first is, after the open spaces are identified and mapped, they need to be published in some sort of like a municipal gazette or that kind of document, so that there is a legal obligation for the local government to protect and promote it. The second thing that needs to be done is the local government should prepare special regulations and strict monitoring mechanism, so that if there is any report regarding misuse of the open space, it could be controlled. The third thing that needs to be done is a lot of orientation and sensitization session. Because in one of my photos, I showed you that a lot of people, they came outside of their house and they lived in wherever open spaces were available. So if people are sensitized and oriented about the value of open space, then they might also understand. And then, in a community, there is a sense of understanding that these sort of locations needs to be prioritized. And the final recommendation is only leaving an area as an open space is not going to guarantee the promotion of the place. So the place could be converted into multiple different structures. So either, let's say, either a park could be built, or either an emergency shelter could be built. So if we can do that, then I think this sort of humanitarian open space gets preserved. And at the time of disaster, they will be a very important location for the displaced population. Before I end my presentation, I would like to request all of you who are interested, to those of you who are interested, to visit this website. You can see all of this data. You can also download the report. And if any one of you is interested on doing similar sort of humanitarian open space mapping exercise in your cities, then we are more than happy to collaborate and talk further about it. If you have any questions, we can do that later on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tam, for that excellent presentation. Thank you. And so let's go straight ahead to panel discussion. Aziz, can you please take us through with that?
Thank you everyone for the wonderful presentations. I'm sure we've all learned a lot from the experts, and we have a couple of questions that we'd like to ask, and we can then discuss. And after that, we'll go through the chat and see the questions that we've got from the audience, and the specific presenters can then address those questions. So since most of us, or all of the presenters, are subject matter experts in terms of drones, we know that the real value of drone data is actualized when it can be interpreted or used by stakeholders to make informed decisions. So I want to know, or can you please elaborate that what can we do to increase the likelihood of drone data being turned into actionable insights in disaster management?
Thank you.
Okay, Jack wants to go first.
Okay. No, I have already, I think, alluded to the relevance of the data. So we must make sure that the data is relevant. And that's why you make it more accessible to them. You present it in a language and in ways that they can relate to. So if they see the relevance of it to their work, they are most likely to use it. And that's what we have done. And that's why they are saying, this is interesting. We want to engage with you a little bit more around this thing. So is that relevance? It must be usable, and it must be in simple and understandable language, which they use, and not more use of technical terms that may be a little bit different from what they are used to. I think that is my answer.
Okay, Jack, thank you. Thank you very much, Jack. Who wants to go next?
Ibrahim, I can add a few more on based on what Zach mentioned. So,
Okay.
I'm also a critic of using drone data for action, because a lot of time what we have seen is organization like us, we end up collecting so much of data set, and then we take around like several weeks to process that data. And then we end up creating maps that takes hours and hours to load on a simple computer. Yeah. So I think, turning drone data into action is a very important thing that any drone consulting organization needs to consider. So based on a few of the practices that we have implemented in Nepal. So one of the example, as I showed you earlier, we need to prepare our outputs in a way that it's easily understandable by the clients and the community. So for example, one of the technique we apply is in almost all of our GIS mapping project, we come up with this concept that I showed earlier, like preparing a map book. So, a map book is usually prepared in a local language. So if we work for any local government, most of the time, like donors or whoever is funding the project, the outputs are usually in English language. So the first thing that we can do to simplify the output is try and create a copy of our final output in a local language, so that at least the people can understand what they are looking on the map. And the second thing we need to do is, when we work on any map, it's always better to come up with more infographics and more visualization next to the map, so that we can help other stakeholders to interpret the map easily. So for example, if we show a heat map and then put some legend, only technical people might understand how to use it. But if we put a heat map, show a few diagrams, and then like give some pictorial information, then it might be easier for stakeholders to understand and interpret it. So that's like the second thing that we can do. And then the third thing that we can do is always, like, if we work on a drone image, and let's for example, let's consider a road survey project. So in a road survey project, if we use a drone, we might end up preparing a centimeter level contour data. But in many cases, our client may not require or may not be able to open that level of heavy data sets, right? So sometimes we can also do downscaling of the resolution and then provide them in a reduced format so that they can easily open and use it for their purpose. So like these are some of the approaches based on our experience.
All right. Okay, thank you very much, Utam. Do we have any other responses from the panelists?
Yes, I would like to add to that. In terms of ensuring that we make drone data actionable, is that the first thing is you need to ensure that those who are the decision makers are aware of the value that you can derive from drone data, especially as it pertains to disaster management, which means you need to raise awareness and you need to ensure that within these institutions, there is a technical capacity to properly specify drone mapping exercises, as well as to interpret and utilize the outputs. In our experience also, what we have done so far is to ensure that as part of every project that requires us to use drones and acquire drone data, we create a capacity building elements of that project. What we do is the partners and the data users, we ensure that we provide training so that they can use the outputs as well as the tools we develop. Another thing we have done is to ensure that usually for you to utilize drone data, you would require high-end software and a lot of those other stuff, is to ensure that we have the outputs in web platforms so that we can have web GIS portals that they can use to manage the data and use the data, which takes away the burden of having to buy high-end and very much complex software. So those are some of the key ways we have been able to ensure that the data we generate can be utilized for policy making as well as for planning and other purposes that will ensure disaster management goes on efficiently.
Thank you, Mansa Musa, for that. Samuel, do you have anything else to add?
I think my colleagues have addressed everything that I would have had to say, so I don't have anything to add at this point in time.
Okay, because of time, I do have a couple of other questions. However, I will go on to my co-host for her to read some of your questions in the chat section. Eunice, over to you.
Okay. So we have a couple of questions here from our audience. So, but I think if we take a look at the chat, our presenters have addressed some of these questions. So let me just quickly scroll through and see if there is any questions that is still unanswered.
There's a recent question from Jimmy. Is there an open source framework for drone disaster management? That's the question.
Oh yeah, so this one is from Jimmy's. He's saying, is there an open source framework for drone disaster management? So who wants to go first with this? Our panelists, do you have any response?
I am not aware of any. I'm not sure if my colleagues on the panel are aware, but we can certainly, I think, investigate.
What sort of framework do you mean, Jimmy? Like, do you mean how to use drones during different phases of disaster, or how to process drone data, or like what sort of framework do you mean? Could you please make it a bit clear?
We're saying overall, the overall methodology.
No, I don't think, I mean, based on my knowledge, I haven't come across with a research that has kind of categorized how drones could be used in different phases of disaster management. But based on our own experience in Nepal, we have written a few articles around how drones could be used in three phases, like before, during, and afterward. But I'm sure there must be something existing, but based on our experience, we have got a few articles written on that and like kind of categorized it. But I'm sure there must be a lot of organizations who have developed their contents, as you mentioned, like, what is the step-by-step process to use drones? What are the different tools and software and logistics required? And I think one thing, just one thing that I want to add on that is, the use of drones, it varies as per the disaster. So for example, if you are looking at the step-by-step guidelines on how to use drones during a flood, it might differ from step-by-step guidelines on how to use drones during landslide. So yeah, it would be a very interesting resource to look into, but I'm not aware of any particular.
Thank you very much, Utam. Are there any other questions from the audience?
I have a question to ask. So, so the use of drones in disaster management, it's sometimes controversial. So with the technology still being somewhat poorly understood, by the public. So with regulations varying from elaborate and fully developed, to non-specific laws and very loose restrictions. Normally, the ethical issues that surround drones are closely linked to information, that collect with consumer-grade drones, being capable of collecting extremely high-resolution imagery or objects on the ground. So what are some of the ethical considerations one should consider when using this technology in disaster management? What ethical considerations should we have in mind?
That's shall I take that question, Ibrahim?
I just typed what Eunice has asked. So
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Eunice, that's a very interesting question. And I took it because currently I'm working on my master's dissertation. And my dissertation title is Challenges of Using Drones in a Disaster Response. So when I was reviewing different articles, I also came across different papers where they have raised this question around ethical challenges and considerations of using drones. I would like to answer that by sharing three different experiences. So first experience, based on my own experience of using drones in Nepal during a disaster scenario. So what happens during a disaster scenario is everyone's priority in a disaster scenario is to save lives. So everyone is concerned about knowing the situational awareness of a particular location and then trying to use every information possible to identify the affected population and then to save their lives. So when the question is about saving lives, then maybe, in the first immediate phase, there might be a little concerns about ethical and privacy related issues. But as people understand more about like what data sets are being captured, then there might be questions by people around how those data sets are being used. So some of the approach that we followed in the past was, whenever we do any drone missions in a disaster affected area, we always coordinate with the local government. So, in a disaster context, you might not be able to do a community engagement exercise because everyone is affected, and then you cannot go to a community and explain to them what you are doing, right? So the first thing you can do is you work together with the emergency responders like police, army, local government, whoever is working on it. And then you try to make them understand what you are doing. So through those local governments, you can communicate that you are collecting very sensitive data, but then that sensitive data will only be used for the purpose of saving lives and for the purpose of relief and rescue items. That's one thing that we did. And the second thing that we did in one of our another project was, sometime there might be some very sensitive locations where you might need to fly drones. I'm talking about a disaster context. So what you can also do is, sometime due to like weather condition or due to other technical limitations, it might be very difficult for you to only fly drones in your concerned area. So what you can do is, after you collect the drone data, you can black out those regions which are considered to be very highly sensitive, and then you just remove those areas and then use the outputs. That's a second approach that you can do. And the third thing is, when we talk about data privacy and data security, and also like ethical concerns from the population, normally when you are working in a low income country in a disaster prone community, like maybe 1% of the people might be aware about what you are doing and what sort of ethical concerns there might be. It doesn't mean that because the community are not aware, you should not communicate and you just collect the data. But what you can do in a normal situation is you can go to the community. So prior to beginning any drone mission, this is what we do a lot of time is community engagement. We go to a community, we show them what kind of data sets we are capturing. And then we kind of like, it's not a written consent that we take, but we kind of take a permission letter from the community representative or the local government, and then we carry the mission. So to summarize, like data privacy and ethical concern is a serious issue. And these are the different approaches that we have been using.
Yeah, I think let me just add to say, yeah, to respect the privacy of the people in the area, it's important. Obviously, and as Utam has said, the objective is to save lives immediately. But then when you have captured those images, it's a question of which images do you make available to the public. For instance, those images you make publicly available, they should respect the privacy of people. They should still ensure that their dignity is left intact. I mean, when we were in Zanin in 2020 on the onset of COVID, we flew over an area where people did not understand what a drone is. So other people hearing a talking drone in the sky, they began running around, and there were few incidents of people running around and naked and all that. And that's what we could see from the sky, but it's not the kind of imagery that you would want to have that video available for public consumption, for instance. So those are some of the considerations that we have to make, respect privacy and make sure their dignity is intact.
Yeah, I would like to add a bit to that. Of course, usually in a disaster situation, especially during response, you find out that the area where you have to do your operation there are a lot of people there, and the place is usually emotionally charged. And therefore, as an operator, you have to know that you're not just doing a normal drone operation whereby you have an SOP that will require you not to be in that sort of environment. So when you find yourself in such an environment, you need to be mindful that the people are grieving, and you need to empathize with them. you need to ensure that you are not coming in with the savior complex and creating an image as if you are there to save the people and all of that. You are actually contributing to the process, but then you need to respect the values and customs of the area you are working in, as well as empathizing with the people by ensuring that you collect your data and respect the dignity of the affected persons.
So in addition to that, one thing that I always ensure when I go to a site is you always have to meet with the local people and to educate them on the use of the drone beforehand. So they would understand that the data that you're collecting is going to be used to help assist them. You have to let them know that, for instance, a lot of people say, hey, are you guys trying to spy on me? Are you trying to take pictures of us? So you always have to let them know also that the pictures that you'll be taking will be used to capture pictures of buildings and roads and other infrastructure, and you're not interested in taking pictures of the people. One thing, however, that I would say would help is if there's a situation where government agencies could come together and at least work with private partners and help in developing a drone sensitization program that aims at educating people about drones before a disaster happens. So whenever a disaster does happen and they see drones being used in a particular area, it will be a situation where they would already know about the use of drones. Because a lot of people also do not know that drones can be used for mapping and for surveying. They typically see the use of drones being primarily around capturing videos and pictures of people as they see on TV and music clips, music videos, and various movies. So I think sensitization before a disaster happens also is very key, and that's something that should be looked into.
Thank you everyone for the responses, and thank you for all the presentation. And I also want to say thank you to all those that attended this webinar. And please be informed that this is a recorded webinar and it will be posted on We Robotics YouTube channel as soon as it's ready. And as a Flying Labs, we hope we will have subsequent webinars wherein we can share knowledge about drones, not only drones in terms of disaster management, but drones in other aspects of the technology itself. On behalf of the Sierra Leone Flying Labs team, on behalf of all the members of the team, I would like to say thank you for attending, and I would like to draw curtains on this webinar. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to all the presenters.
Thank you, and
Thank you.
to the
Thank you very much.
presenters,
Thank you, everyone.
well
All right.
done, well
Thank
done.
you, everyone.
This was really, really great. Well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Here's the link to our YouTube channel. Thank you, everyone.